Let's see if this is working. It is working. Okay, so I am live. Back on the channel. What to talk about? I end the world. Yes, I have that kind of power, but that's only because I'm a writer. So I'm ending the world. I have a book. I've mentioned it a couple of times on here. You're probably getting sick of me teasing this thing. I'm at chapter 86 of 100, and 100 is actually written. So I got a dozen more chapters to go, and then we'll see what I do with it. I'll probably put it on Amazon or an ebook or something like that. There's no illustrations or anything. It's all just text. It is about how the human world ends, and I'm going to very specifically make a point that in my book, the human world comes to an end. I have said elsewhere on this channel that humans, our species, lives in what many people, not just me, call a built habitat. Every animal, plants as well, but let's just stick to animals. Every animal requires a habitat. Humans require a habitat. And what do we need in our habitat? We need the usual stuff, right? Food, water, shelter. Back in the day, we would take shelter from caves or thickets or natural overhangs. You can find habitat that people made in the American Southwest that are just way up on a cliff, but they're under a natural cliff overhang. So they would go up there and they would pile rocks up and they would just use this overhang as protection from, probably mostly from the sun, but from rain as well. And they would live up there. Later on, they would dig. Other peoples have built tunnels into mountainsides and even very elaborate, completely underground cities exist in older parts of the world, like Turkey, former Mesopotamia, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia. Even there are ancient settlements where people made their own habitat from food, water, and shelter, and sometimes they made their own shelter. But a lot of the times, people just existed in natural habitat, whatever they could find. These days, all humans, I'll say all, essentially it's all. It's a tiny fraction of people who do not do this. These days, all humans live in a built habitat. So not just digging a tunnel inside of a mountain or taking advantage of an overhang. Actually constructing cities out of stone or out of wood or out of poured concrete and steel and things like this. We build our habitat. And as we have become increasingly dependent, that's the word, dependent on built habitat, we have become, I don't want to say less human, I want to say more domesticated, like any other animal that has learned to survive by being fed food and brought their water and brought their medications and protected from predators and protected from the elements. We become domesticated. We are less wild than our predecessors. So humans today live in a built habitat. Everybody does. It varies. There's a sliding scale of heavily built up, like living in a big modern city, to slightly built up, living in a mud brick house in a less developed part of the world. You still built that house. You still built it out of mud. And there might be electricity. There might be internet access, cell phone access, and other things like that. So it's all part of the built habitat. A lot of places that are considered third world, developing parts of the human experiment, nevertheless have imported water, imported electricity, irrigation, farm tractors, fossil fuels. They have a lot of stuff. Maybe they still live in a brick house, a clay brick house with a tin roof. But if you follow them around during the course of their day, they're interacting with all kinds of technology. Do they need that technology to survive? Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to deprive them of their technology and see what happens. But that does happen. Those experiments, we don't need to do those on purpose. Those experiments happen fairly frequently. So I'm writing this book, and I'm writing this book on how the human world ends. Again, the human world. Let me just change to my picture-in-picture here. What I'm really talking about, you see these pictures? I just did a quick search. Abandoned city, overgrown with plants. This is what happens when you abandon the human world. When the humans are not dominant in the human world, it goes back to nature. So these are not pictures. Some of these are actual photographs. Some of these are rendering, either artificial intelligence or people working with software. You can find this though. You can find pictures just like this. This can be photographs, and in many cases, you can find places just like this. One of the more famous ones, I'm sure you've seen it, are pictures that come out of Pripyat. Pripyat is a Ukrainian city near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant that blew itself to rat shit. And the city of Pripyat had to be abandoned essentially overnight due to radiological threats. So people just left Pripyat and it went back to nature. And people now go back there kind of as tourists. They take their cameras and whatever, and they study the animals and they study the plants, and they're finding images like this in Pripyat. So the end of the human world, specifically, I'm not talking about a meteor strike or a sun going supernova. The end of the human world means that nature comes back. And few people would disagree with the statement that humans have really impacted nature on this planet. Do I need to give examples? They're everywhere. And when we stop doing that, nature comes back. So this book is very specifically about this kind of image, the end of the human world, where it's not the end of the world, it's not the end of life on the earth. I just don't think that's a scenario. I just don't see how that's a scenario. If global heating gets completely out of hand, then there might be some of that goes on in some places, but you'll always be able to find places where nature prevails, and especially in the absence of humans. So the question then becomes, okay, how do you have the end of the human world without the end of the world? Now, people so I'm a fiction writer, but I'm a scientist and an engineer and all these things. And I have other stories I'm working on that contain fantasy elements. But even when I'm doing fantasy elements, just straight up fantasy, goddesses, witches, the whole thing, I try to base my work on as much practical research as possible. So when I was doing this, originally a short story that became now this novel, it's up to like 280 pages or something. Some of the pages are short, meaning 280 chapters. Some of the chapters are short. They're just 2 or 3 paragraphs, and then some of them are quite long. But it's 280 some odd pages. It represents like 100 chapters. So you kind of get the idea. I'm trying to base it, though, as much as possible on real world scenarios. And to do a real world scenario about how the human world ends, that's actually my premise, is I'm not interested in the end of the world. Zombies and aliens and meteors and, hellfire from heaven. I'm interested in how the human world ends, the built habitat, how that fails. And the reason I'm doing this video is I want to talk about that. Because there are multiple ways in which the built habitat fails us. And in the course of writing this, now a novel, and thinking about how it ends, why it ends, there are reasons, and how people respond to it, because it's called a trajectory story. So, and you're familiar with these. There's an event that happens in the beginning somewhere. Boom, event. And then the event could be completely done. A meteor strike would be such an event. Meteor strike, boom. That's it. You get one. You get one meteor strike, and then there's this trajectory of what all happens as you go. A viral outbreak is another type of trajectory study. Viral outbreak, wham. Everybody gets the virus. A lot of people die. A lot of people become immune to it. And after that, the virus doesn't really have any effect on it. But now you have a trajectory. Okay, what happens to the survivors after the viral outbreak and so on? So this is a trajectory study. And of course, I set up the premise in the beginning. I talk about the built world, the world that we built for our sense, our own uses, for our purposes. And then I talk about, I do the setup, right? I do the thing. I do the meteor strike. What happened to the human world? And how do the humans, because there's no story if there's no humans, right? How do the humans that come after this cope? How do they change? What do they give up? What do they adopt? What do they bring forward? What do they leave behind? And all this kind of stuff. And it's been interesting. I've been reading a lot of stories like this, and sometimes taking concepts from those. This is what you're supposed to do when you're a writer. You read other people's writings. But I'm being very careful because I have a feeling, as a biologist and an engineer, I have a feeling of how this would work. I have an informed opinion of where all this goes. So these types of images, I'll just scroll through a few of these so this is more interesting for you. Because I don't really have any material myself. These sorts of images is what I'm hearkening back to. Now, this is the outcome, right? This is the outcome. But how do we get here? How do we end the human world? So, how much to talk about this? Yes, I'm going to publish this story, book, novel, whatever it is, and then you'll get a chance to look at it, and you'll get the whole story. But in the story, okay, part of what reason I'm doing this video is that part of this just happened actually in the real world, IRL, in real life. And what was it? What am I talking about? I'm talking about the fires in Southern California, the Palisades fire, the Altadena fire, and before that, the Malibu fire, and before that, the Paradise fire and the Red Bluff fire and all the others. Here in California, we have a real problem with fire, not because it burns things, because some of this stuff is kind of intended to burn. Some of this brush and some of the forest floor is meant to burn. The problem is that we build in these places that are really susceptible to fire. We build in these places, and that's when the disasters happen. If we weren't there, then the fires would burn and we go, meh, whatever. But since we've built in these places, and why have we done that? Because there's no more real estate and people are looking to live outside the city, and so they go up in the mountains and they build and they have a lot of money because they're leaving the city. Why do you leave the city? Because you've retired, you've made your millions, you're whatever, you sold your company. Now you're going to go live out in somewhere not in the city. And you can't find anywhere that's not in the city that isn't farmland, right? So you don't want to live in the farmland. Some people might, but most people want to go live up in the hills, and so that's what they do. And you find all these really expensive homes, really wealthy communities, because people tend to congregate according to economic status. There you go. And you have these wealthy communities that are all built into these forested and brushed areas, like Pacific Palisades, like Altadena, like Pasadena. And you then have a problem because these places will catch fire. And because of global heating, these places are more likely to catch fire than maybe in the past. Well, certainly more likely now than in the past. So we have this setup, and so I can write a story about this. We have a setup. We have a setup where humans have built habitat, a built world, a built human world. You get it? A built human world. We have built the human world in places where we probably shouldn't be. And we have built our world in a way that is vulnerable to disruptions, that is brittle, that is more prone to collapse than we even thought, that requires fossil fuels to maintain itself. And of course, this channel is about global heating and about, tangentially, because these two are connected, about what happens when we run out of fossil fuels. So I started writing this story 6 months ago, working out in my own mind what is happening to us. And now as it approaches completion, I'm thinking about, well, what does the story tell me? And so I'm here to share some of that with you. The human world, the built human world. Let me change this slide here a little bit. The built human world is constructed completely, 100%, on the cheap and available resource we call fossil fuels. If you don't have fossil fuels, in particular crude oil, but to some extent coal and natural gas as well, you really need all three. But if you don't have crude oil, cheap and readily available, then you cannot maintain the human world. And you can question that. You can say, but wind power, but solar power. Okay, I am the researcher here. I have looked into it. And I have studied this, and I have analyzed people's comments on this, and I've looked at the data. And I'm here to tell you. Here's the truth as best as I can figure it out. You can't have modernity without cheap and ready access to fossil fuels. It's worth repeating. This is the crux of it. Everything I'm about to tell you, and everything I would tell you on this channel, and everything I have told you on this channel, everything I have thought worth discussing, peeling off an hour a day of my time to sit here and bloviate into a camera, okay, is based upon this proposition. You cannot have modernity without cheap, ready access to crude oil. You cannot have the modern human world without cheap and ready access to fossil fuels, in particular crude oil. And what's the magic number again? Humans pump from the ground 100 million barrels per day of crude oil. 100 million barrels per day of crude oil, none of which is stored. Amounts of storage go up and down depending on crises and prices and things like that. But net of net, sometimes we store it, sometimes we pull it out of storage, and sometimes we put it back into storage. Net of net, we still consume 100 million barrels of crude oil daily, every single day. And what do you think that's doing? Do you think the energy companies are just pumping it out of the ground, laughing and setting it on fire? No. They don't waste a drop of it. Every drop has value. It gets turned into things we use, products and services. In Cuba, they burn it. They burn crude oil, raw crude oil, straight out of the ground to generate electricity. Now, other parts of the world don't do that. That's considered wasteful. But Cuba does that because they were being given raw crude oil right out of the ground by Russia. Russia was giving it to them. They were supporting a fellow communist state. And when the Russians stopped doing that, then the Venezuelans did it, supporting a fellow communist state. And the Cubans take the crude oil right out of the ground, right off the ship, and set it on fire and burn it to generate electricity. Elsewhere in the world, we take crude oil as feedstock, and we use it to make plastics, thousands of different types of chemicals for pharmaceuticals and everything else. And of course, obviously, we fractionate it into various fuels. Kerosene for jets, diesel, and gasoline. And the human, I want to repeat this. Modernity, the built human world, could not have been built and cannot be maintained without ready access to cheap and abundant fossil fuels, in particular crude oil. 100 million barrels per day. In my novel, that access to crude oil becomes slightly curtailed. And a slight curtailment, and this is how desperate our situation actually is. A modest curtailment implodes the built human world. It's all in the book. It's all in the story. I'm speaking in this case as strictly as an engineer. I know what it takes to run the world. I know what it takes. And what it takes is constant access to cheap and available fossil fuels, in particular crude oil. Without that, modernity collapses. And when you understand that, you start to understand why, despite our increasing concern about global heating, and the resulting climate change, despite our universal, near universal agreement that this is in fact a crushing problem, we have not reduced our reliance on fossil fuels, in particular crude oil, one bit. In fact, all the time since the Paris Climate Accords, which was what, 2015 or something, since that time, when we were supposed to be reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. Why? Because it's heating the planet. It's going to make parts of the planet, if not all the planet, uninhabitable for human purposes if we keep doing this. That's just science, folks. If you don't believe it, well, don't believe it. I don't care what you believe. Physics wins, all right? Gravity, global heating, same realm. It's all physics. Oh, I don't like the models. I think the scientists have an agenda. It's a conspiracy. Think whatever you like. You're going to stick your head out the front door one of these days and find that the human world has changed to a point where you can't live there. Why? Because of global heating. There you go. That's the projection. Whether it's 10 years from now or 20 years from now or 30 years from now, it doesn't matter. Your mileage may vary, but it's going to happen to everybody eventually. Some more than others. Despite the fact that we know this, and despite the fact that we keep coming together year after year after year to talk about this, and yell at each other, and scream at each other, and threaten each other, and we come away with nothing. Every year, these people get together, and they're saying things like, "My nation will be destroyed by this if we don't tackle this. My nation, is going to be overrun. My nation will become uninhabitable if we don't do something about this." And they come together every year and they say the same thing. And every year they go their separate ways with no progress at all. And the reason why there can be no progress is because we cannot stop doing this. We can't. And no one else will tell you this but me. No one else will tell you this but me. And I'm telling you, we cannot stop burning crude oil and coal and natural gas. We cannot stop. We cannot. We all of us, even some sub-Saharan farmer with who nevertheless has a tractor, all of us are dependent on cheap, reliable, steady access to fossil fuels 24/7. Because that's a fact, we still, despite our knowledge of what's going to happen to us if we don't stop, we still pump out of the ground, just talking about the crude oil, 100 million barrels every single day, and set them on fire. And all that CO2 and methane goes into the atmosphere. And then we do it again the next day and the day after that. And we can never do less than that. We can never decrease that. Because as soon as you decrease it, you chip away at modernity. You just do. And in the story, okay, spoilers. Let me tie this back to Los Angeles, which is why I'm here. What happened in LA? People, I still hear this argued. It's ridiculous. It makes me smile. It's so ridiculous. And people are coping, right? There's so much cope going on that people will tell you, oh, well, the fires in LA, that was caused by the drought. That was caused because the mayor was in Ghana on a junket. That was caused by the reservoir being empty. The fire in Altadena, those people have lived there for 100 years in those very same houses. But the fire that destroyed Altadena was caused by, whatever. A reservoir being empty. That caused the fire. Okay, no, that's not what caused the fire. And the reservoir had nothing to do with it. The reason that Altadena burnt down completely, and this was in my prior video, just go back and watch that. I'm not going to repeat this whole thing again. The reason Altadena burned down inside the city is because of 100-mile-an-hour winds blowing the fire into the city and it being completely unstoppable. A hurricane of flames. 100-mile-an-hour winds, gusting to 100-mile-an-hour winds. It's a hurricane of flames. The same thing in Pacific Palisades. It was a hurricane of fire. You can't fight a hurricane of fire by pissing on it. And that's all those people were doing with their little hoses, their fire engines, and even when they hook up to the fire hydrant, it's just a little hose. Hooking up to the fire hydrant with your little hose just means you can hose for longer, but you're still pissing in the wind. It's a 100-mile-an-hour firestorm. The chances of fighting that are zero. And so, yes, there's a drought, and there's a mayor out of town, and the reservoir was empty, and this and that and the other thing, and it's like, whatever, think whatever you like, I guess. But those people are done. And complicating their situation now is that, so the insurance companies will pay out, but they'll pay out on what they think the value of the property is. And so now you'll get X number of dollars, but the price of rebuilding is Y over here. And the price of rebuilding goes up and up and up and up and up as everybody starts rebuilding at once. I mean, do you think that contractors aren't going to bid up the price of rebuilding your home? Here's the contractor shows up. All the homeowners rush out of their tents at the same time. Can you rebuild my home? What'll it cost? And he's looking around left and right and thinking, well, these are all rich people. They've got money. They've even got insurance payouts. Let's see. How much can I get out of these people? Of course they're going to do that. The guy at the jewelry store that sells diamonds, he's thinking, well, this married couple, they look happy. I wonder what I can get for this ring. I wonder what I can get for this necklace. They eyeball the buyer and they figure out what they can get for him. That's capitalism. You don't like capitalism? Well, then too bad, because now you're living in a capitalist society. And, it's market forces determine the price of things. So the market is hot now to rebuild homes in Southern California. And when the contractors show up, they're going to look left and right and they're going to say, well, I could work for you or I could work for you, but it's going to cost you. Which of you is willing to pay more per square foot to rebuild your home? $200, $500, $1,000 a square foot, $2,000 a square foot? It's like an auction. You just bid them up. And when everyone walks away, but the last guy standing was willing to pay you $2,000 a square foot to rebuild his home because he's a multimillionaire, whatever his story is, right? Then that's the contract you take on. And you build his place first, and you spend 6 months doing it. And then when you're done with that, you come back to the same neighborhood and you say, well, I just rebuilt the house across the street for $2,000 a square foot. What are you going to pay? That's now the market rate, $2,000 a square foot. So long and short, the fires, which were 100% caused by global heating, see my last video, is going to make it difficult to impossible for these people to come back. So what happens? What happens if these people can't come back? And do you even want to rebuild your house at even $2,000 a square foot when you're just going to be in a neighborhood with abandoned homes? I mean, not even homes, just foundations, right? The ashes are gone because FEMA came in and cleaned up your shit for you. You don't like FEMA. You think FEMA spends their money on poor people and who cares about poor people? Well, FEMA just came in and cleaned up your toxic dump for you. Shut up about FEMA, please. And now, but still, you're the only house on the block. How's that feel? Well, the view is great. Really? You don't want to have neighbors? You don't want your kids to play with other children? You don't want a school down the street? Because they're not going to rebuild the school if your house is the only one on the lot for a half a mile in all directions. Is Costco going to come back to these neighborhoods? Is a 7-Eleven going to come back to these neighborhoods? Is there going to be a service station when you're the only house for, in a square mile? No. In fact, because of the problem that they now have and the price to rebuild and the problems with the insurance and everything that cannot be fixed, nobody will rebuild. There'll be a few maybe stubborn, blockheaded people who said, I'm going to rebuild no matter what. And if they've got the money, then they can pull that off. And great for them, I guess. But the rest of it is just going to probably stay empty because no one can afford to. And they're done. And now this is a big piece of the built world that is gone and will stay gone because of economic pressures. The same thing happened in Paradise. The Paradise Fire, what was it called? The Camp Fire. Burned Paradise to the ground. Not a big town, not a lot of people. Killed 89 people, by the way. And no one's rebuilding there. Now, you can have a rebuild scenario. And now I have to get back to the book. You can have a rebuild scenario. You could rebuild Altadena and Pacific Palisades because they are, at least in theory, embedded in a functioning modern world. Maybe the Home Depot in Altadena burned down. Maybe the Home Depot in Pacific Palisades burned down, or the Lowe's. But if you drive 10 miles in any direction, maybe 15, maybe 20, it's still there. There's still a Lowe's and there's a Home Depot and there's all kinds of contractors who can offer their services. And of course the utility companies are still there. They can come in from the outside and they can repair the electric and the water and the gas and the everything. and because they're outside the disaster. But if your disaster is big enough to affect entire regions, and of course, at the outside, the entire world, then there is nobody. There's nowhere for you to go for refuge. Because as you're headed that direction, there's people where you're going who are headed your direction with exactly the same problem, right? And so you're thinking, wow, why am I going east when the people in the east are coming west looking for the same thing I'm looking for? That's the point where you just sit down in the middle of the road. Where am I going then? The people in the town east of me are coming to my town looking for the same thing I'm hoping they have. Well, they obviously don't have it. I didn't know that. But now that I've met them and I'm asking, where are you coming from? We're coming from Eastville. And well, that's where I'm going. When they're telling you, don't go to Eastville. We just left there. And so if your problem is big enough, then there's nowhere to go. And probably no way to get there. And in the book, that's exactly what happens. There's enough of a disruption of the modern world, modernity, this house of cards we've built over 300 years. There's enough of a collapse of that some of these pictures are really eerie. These are called liminal spaces, meaning it doesn't look quite right. I mean, it's real. It's, plants growing inside of a building, and you could find buildings like this in the world. You can find places that have been abandoned, but they're liminal spaces. They're like, they trouble you. They're like, what happened here? Why am I here? Am I in the wrong place? What is going on here? These are liminal places. So in the story, there is enough of a small disruption in fossil fuels, and there is enough of a small nuclear exchange. It's just tiny. It's just like a couple of countries attack each other with a couple of things, that it causes a global panic. That's it. Panic. That's all it takes, to be honest. I saw, and that's exactly what it would take, because I saw a paper, or a discussion of a paper that was published fairly recently, like in the last 20 years, where they looked at nuclear apocalypse, if you like to call it that, where if you launched every nuclear missile and you dropped every nuclear bomb and you sent all the nuclear things, that would cost in human lives 20% of the human population. 20% of 8 billion people would die in the nuclear holocaust. That's a big number. 20%, 25% is 2 billion people. So 2 billion people out of 8 billion people would probably die. That's not very many. The Black Plague that hit Europe during the Middle Ages killed half of the population of Europe. Half. So even a nuclear holocaust, nuclear annihilation, Armageddon, whatever you want to call it, isn't sufficient, would barely make a dent. We would make up 20% losses in the human population in one generation. We're growing at about that rate right now. We're growing at about 1 billion people every 20 years or so. So we'd make up 2 billion people lost in no time at all. Literally, you wouldn't even notice. But what these things do is they cause a panic. And let me explain to you the role of panic. And here I have to go back to Pacific Palisades. The fire came fast. People weren't ready. And not that it matters, by the way. Not that it matters. The same thing happened in Paradise. The fire comes quickly, but people aren't ready because people are never ready. Okay, they're never ready. They're in denial. They don't understand. They don't think that houses burn. As far as they know, the fire has never come into the city. It only burns up in the hills. They just don't understand. They just don't understand what's happening to them. And so in Pacific Palisades, full of rich people, and rich people are supposed to be smart, right? How else did they get rich? Well, they ain't that smart, turns out, because they panicked. And they got onto the streets all at the same time, because everyone gets the same message at the same time, and they all panic pretty much within the same minute. And they got on the roads, and what immediately happened was the roads became impassable. Why? Because of panic. because people who are driving and they're scared and they're pissing themselves and the dog is yapping and the wife are screaming and the children are crying and where's my dog and I left my dolly behind and everyone's screaming and you're trying to drive and then the smoke comes across the road and you're thinking, oh my God, we're all going to burn to death. And this is how people behave. And they stop the car. And they stop the car. The smoke is, and the embers or whatever, right? They stop the car. Oh my God, scream, 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 scream. What happens when a car stops, when a driver stops their car? There's 150 or 300, maybe 500 cars behind them trying to do the same thing. And maybe the car just ahead of them went through the smoke, but they can't because they're terrified and they're sitting there in their car and they don't know what to do, having a panic attack. Fire, smoke, I've never seen this in my life. I don't know what to do. Panic, panic, panic. And then the cars behind them get stopped. And then someone tries to go around. But the person in the car opens their door and the car going around hits the door. Now there's an accident. And of course, everybody, when there's an accident, you get out of your car, you exchange, insurance, providers and you do the whole thing. Well, and now there's two cars stuck in the road because everyone doesn't know what to do. And pretty soon cars are trying to drive up on the sidewalk to get away because people are behind this saying, I don't give a shit if you're afraid to go through the smoke. I'm okay with it. But there's smoke. And so they hit something. They hit a pole or telephone pole or a parked car, or they hit a car backing out of a driveway and they just T-bone into them. And pretty soon, watch what happens. In 15 seconds, that road is impassable. 15 seconds, starting with someone simply having a panic attack. And it goes this way and that way, and in 15 seconds, maybe 20, the whole road is impassable. And this is what happened in Altadena. And later on, when the first responders, not Altadena, Pacific Palisades, and later on, when the first responders tried to use these same roads to get up into the hills to fight the fires, the roads are full of abandoned vehicles. And when people abandon their vehicles, they take the keys. Why not? That's what you do when you get out of your car. You don't think, well, someone may need to move this car when the fires are over, or the smoke or whatever, and you take your keys. Now these cars are locked and parked. And so before the first responders could get into the hills to try and save the houses, they had to bring in a bulldozer, which means you have to bring it in on a fucking trailer hauled by a semi-tractor trailer truck, and then they have to move all these stupid vehicles out because there's no keys in the ignitions. Panic. It panicked. It stopped everything. And that's what all humans have in common. That's why any stress to the system, any stress at all, a fire in the mountains, a shortage of fossil fuels, food supply interruption, anything at all that can cause people to panic leads to a shutdown of the system. A shutdown of the system. And in my book, I talk about how rapidly and for what reasons the system shuts down. And it all has to do with panic. And panic is universal. Everybody does it. You think you won't, but you will. I promise you. You will. You'll wait too long. Everybody's this way. It's not a personal problem, right? Everybody is like this. You wait too long. You don't believe it. Your neighbor isn't doing anything. You talk to your neighbor. They're not worried, so now you're not worried. Everyone's worried about looting or being away from their house when it burns. Instead, they're going to be there with a fire hose fighting the fire, so they're going to stay. Everyone thinks these same thoughts in terms of just fire. Everyone thinks that the government will make it fine. The National Guard will show up. I've been watching the news. Other communities are staying in place. They're not heeding the evacuations. Everyone thinks the same thing. It won't happen to me. It can't happen in my neighborhood. We're immune because we're wealthy. Houses don't burn, and I've got a gun, and my neighbors are good neighbors, and I trust them. And everyone thinks the same thing. And they stay in place. They stay put. They stay in place. And in the end, they wait too long. The people who get out first, get out. The roads are open. The service stations are open and they have gasoline. The electricity's on. They can actually, over the phone, book a hotel room in the next town over. The people who get out early, get out. And the ones who wait, for whatever reason, there's dozens of reasons to just not do it, including it's just inconvenient, right? I need to get to work in the morning. The kids the kids are still at school. I can't do anything right now. I think I've got plenty of time. And so they don't move for whatever reason. And there's, like I said, there's dozens of reasons. And everyone has more than one reason not to go, including fear of their being looted or something like that. And everybody waits too long. There's also the phenomenon that a lot of people have nowhere to go. They're living so close to the edge all the time, what we call paycheck to paycheck. Maybe not in Pacific Palisades, but certainly places like Altadena or Paradise or Redding or Red Bluff or whatever. They're living so close to the edge that the concept that they were going to leave their home, which they just paid the mortgage on, so this is free, right? I can live here. And going someplace where they have to pay by the night and just abandon their home and go someplace to pay every night, probably inflated rates because there's a big crisis, right? Inflated rates to not be home. It just doesn't make sense. And they don't have the money for it. They're living paycheck to paycheck. They're gonna waste their money. They don't really see they don't in the balance. They see that the marginal improvement in my safety, because I don't really know how dangerous this is. So I can't really evaluate what kind of danger I'm running away from, right? I just can't. I just don't have the mental throw. I don't have the data. I don't have the time. I can't really evaluate the risk. And humans are crap at evaluating risks, by the way. This has been demonstrated countless times. Against the real risk, the actual risk that I know exactly what's going to happen if I spend the money. If I leave my house and I go to a faraway place, I lose that money, guaranteed. Because I know what the cost is, and I don't know how much money I have, and I know my car, and the gasoline, and the expenses, and the eating out. I know exactly what's going to cost me. I'm not too sure about the risk, so I'm trying to weigh the cost against the risk, the benefit against the risk, and it's just not working out for me. So I stay where I am, because I don't understand the risk, and it's money, which is so important to me. The risk is I waste money. It's like people can't do that, wasting money. Oh no, I can't. Whatever. It's just, I can't even think about wasting money. So I'll just take a chance on staying in my home because I really don't understand the risk at all. The risk is dying, whatever. I mean, other people, it happens to other people. It's not going to happen to me. What do you mean? I'm going to have to spend this money if I leave, but dying? I don't know. How do you figure that, right? And so they do leave. They do make a move. They do take the hit financially at some point, because the fire is at the back of the house, or whatever the crisis is. And the Altadena thing, again, reinforces this, teaches us this. The Altadena problem, I love these images. I find these very soothing. Where are the people? Where do the people go? What's happening here? This is the human world. What happened? There's a lot of things that can trigger panic. A lot of things that happen suddenly. The chief among them isn't going to be the fires, because that's just a regional thing, and then the region that burned is surrounded by a region that did not. So the money pours in, the support pours in. There's houses you can live in that didn't burn. There's hotels. There's restaurants and supermarkets where you can get food and water. And so you lost your home, but you didn't lose your civilization. But there are lots of things that can cause us to lose civilization. And I think chief among, you could say, pandemics, nuclear war. This doesn't even come close. Doesn't even come close. It would be terrible, and it would be costly, and the costs, both financially and in human life, would be just incredible and unpredictable. But that's not actually what ends modernity. The way people react to these things does not end modernity. COVID didn't. COVID-19 did not. Affected the entire planet, and yet it didn't. What will? And what ends the world, what ends modernity, what terminates the built human habitat, is an interruption in fossil fuels, in particular crude oil. How does that happen? There's actually a lot of ways that can happen. War can happen. You can have war in the Middle East. Iran and Saudi Arabia are both major producers. And they hate each other. So if they actually decided to go kinetic, that would be a lot of oil taken offline, like in a day or 3 or a week. That would the loss of oil from Iran and Saudi Arabia would affect the entire planet. Now, the U.S. produces a lot of its own oil. So in theory, we could keep our oil and keep our own thing going on. But we don't manufacture very much stuff anymore. We get a lot of our manufactured goods from some combination of Europe and China. Less Europe these days, more China. China has cheap labor, slave labor in fact, and no environmental regulations. So they can produce things cheaply that here in the U.S. or even in Europe, it's harder to do at that price point. So, but the Chinese are even more dependent on fossil fuels, in particular crude oil, than America is. We make our own. They don't. So if there's a significant interruption in crude oil availability, then the built world in China collapses quickly. And they have a lot of people and a lot of things that can go wrong, including panic, including everyone in China suddenly wanting to be someplace else because they run on crude oil and the crude oil has to be imported. And if there's a small reduction in the crude oil availability, people panic. And that's all it takes, people panicking. What do people do when they panic? They go fill up at the service station and they take extra containers, and pretty soon the service station is out of fuel, and then people really panic. Oh my God, where's the fuel? I can't get any fuel today. I needed to fill up my car. Now there's no fuel. The service station is closed. Why? Because there's been no fuel delivery. Well, maybe if you waited a day or two, there would be, but that's not what you do. You panic. And then people are pulling money out of the bank, and then the banks close, and then the banks don't give people money anymore. And where's the money? Well, it went the same place the fuel did. We don't even know. It's just not there. And panic, panic, panic. And then they're getting on airplanes, and they're flying to the U.S. And the U.S. is having a slightly different kind of crisis, And maybe we don't let the people into the U.S. anymore. We say, no, you can't come here from China or India or Europe or the U.K. or even anywhere else. You can't come here. We don't want you here. Because you're panicking. You need to go back home. So then they send them back home. And then there's a panic. Why? You mean people can't even leave the country and go to some place that has crude oil? Well, what are we supposed to do? Panic, panic, panic. And then it becomes riots. And then it becomes looting. And then they're stealing everything that they can't, if they can't get money out of the bank because the banks ran out of cash, as of course what happened. Well, then they go and they break into the stores. And now the stores are being looted. And sometimes the stores are set on fire, either on accident or on purpose. So when the truck finally pulls up to restock the shelves in the store isn't there. The employees have left. They've gone home. They're panicking too. And the store shelves are empty. And there's no one to empty the truck. And the driver of the truck says, fine, I'll just take this truckload home. And he takes it to his village. Now his village has whatever was in the truck, vegetables, rice, beans, whatever was in there. And the order just breaks down completely because of what? Panic. Because people panic. And that's what people do. They don't believe it. It's not going to happen to me. It can't be true. It's a hoax. It's whatever. It's AI, whatever, it's all fake news. And then when suddenly it isn't. And when they told you, well, the people are pulling cash out of the banks and the banks are closing because they don't want to run on the bank. And then you go to your bank and you try to pull some cash out and the bank is closed. Then you join the panic. If there's cash controls and they say, yeah, you can get money out of this bank if you need money, but you can only get a small amount because they're trying not to get shut down. But you interpret that as capital controls. And so you panic and you break the door and you break the window and you go inside looking for your money. Well, they don't keep the money inside. There are not people in there with bags of money that they're hoarding. And now the bank is destroyed. Why? Panic. That's how the human world ends. It doesn't end in nuclear Armageddon because some stupid Russian pushed the wrong button. That's not how the human world ends. And it doesn't end in a lab-released virus that makes everyone a zombie and eating human flesh. That's not how the human world ends. The human world ends in a panic because that's how people are. Some little thing happens and everybody panics. And then there's cars abandoned in the streets, and the stores are looted and set on fire, and the banks run out of money, and then the banks close, and you can't get your money, and you got nothing, and you're panicking. And you're stealing from your neighbor, and you're stealing from the shop down the street, and you're breaking into things, you're destroying things, you're killing people, and you have guns, and blood, and violence, and looting. Because of panic. That's how the world ends. People Just panic. And if you're not panicking, you're sitting there watching all this and you're being kind of amused. Well, these people, I guess they never gave much thought to their life and what they needed to survive. And here they are, and I've got, $5,000 in my house, and I got guns and bullets, and I've got all this stored food, and I'm not panicking. And you're looking at all your neighbors panicking, and one of them stops in front of your house and say, well, why aren't you panicking? I'm not worried. You're not? Why? Why aren't you worried? And then what do you say? I'm going to be okay. Yeah, you got something in there for me and my starving family? You got something? Because I'm in a panic. And then you don't have anything, or you're dead, or you're fighting for your life, and everyone's trying to get in because they now know you've got something. They don't even know what you got. What do you got? I don't know, but he's got something. He's protecting something. What, he's got money? He's got food? I don't really care about the money, but he's got food and water. What's he got in there? Panic. You think you're going to be okay. You're not. Now, in the book, a group of people kind of understand all this.
Sorry, I didn't understand.
That's Google responding to me. A group of people, I guess that sounds like what Google wants to hear. A group of people recognize the threat. And the threat...
My apologies. I don't understand.
Am I going to have to unplug that thing? And the threat is collapse of modernity. And the threat to modernity is panic. And in a large enough, widespread enough catastrophe, even if it's fairly abstract, like the banks have closed because it runs on the bank. Even if it's pretty abstract, like, well, the shelves are empty at the store, I could wait till tomorrow, but today I think I'm just going to panic. It could be something really marginal that everyone comes to the same conclusion at the same time. And what they do is they panic because they're worried that they're going to miss out. Okay? That's what it takes. And if the entire planet falls into a panic, and it doesn't take much, that's the key to this whole thing. It doesn't take much. You can get people to panic over virtually nothing. Then the agreement that keeps modernity working completely collapses. It just collapses outright. No one follows the laws. No one waits for the truck to show up. No one shares. No one waits in line. No one helps their neighbor. No one, tries to preserve, civilized behavior. Everyone panics. And when they panic, they all act the same. And that's because all humans are the same. All humans are the same in the end. And when you're forced with, well, I got to either run away or I have to die, then you panic. And all humans will do exactly the same thing. And the key to this is they all do it at almost exactly the same time. We are not different intellectually or morally or spiritually. We are not different at all. None of us can rise above the limits of human behavior. And as I've said on this channel before, although I talk about global heating and climate change and weather disasters and things like that, I'm not really interested in the data about global heating and climate change. I could be, and there are lots of people on the internet, on YouTube in particular, that are. And they'll talk to you about the numbers. My wife, she loves the numbers. She's all about the numbers. How many hundreds of millions of barrels of oil do we pump today? How hot is the world on average today? And it's kind of comforting to have something to focus on as you deal with these enormous pending disasters. Something to focus on. And I'm okay with that, but I don't do that. Again, I'm a scientist and an engineer. I know enough about what's happening that I've moved beyond. I've moved beyond the numbers. I'm now looking at human behavior. What are people going to do? And what I have learned in my studies and my research, and just thinking about recent events like the fires in LA, in particular Pacific Palisades, what people are going to do universally, all at the same time, all for the same reason, is panic. They're going to panic. And everything that you thought was resilient about civilization is going to turn out to be brittle and ephemeral. When people start to panic, they don't care about the law. They don't care about conventions. They don't care about each other. They don't care about waiting in line and sharing and supporting each other. They just give up on all of that because it seems like it's going to hold them back. And when they panic, they want to run. Now, I think that's how all of modernity collapses. It doesn't collapse because of nuclear weapons, and it doesn't collapse because of the COVID virus, and it doesn't do any of those things because those aren't big enough. What is universal, common across all peoples, in all places, in all economic and political systems, what everyone has in common, everyone who's an adult, everyone who has children, everyone who has a community they care about, everybody who has any thoughts about anything, what they all share in common is panic. And that's what they will do. Every time there's disaster, people panic. They wait too long. They don't believe it. They're in denial. They can't make a move. It's too expensive. It's too dangerous. It's too disruptive. I have a job to get to, and the kids are still in school, and I can't leave my house, and the looters, and I have to protect, and the fire hose, and putting out the fire. Everyone thinks the same thing until the last minute. And they all get to the last minute at the same time because they're all thinking the same processes. And they're waiting for the fire department to come, and they're waiting for the police to come, and they figure the FEMA is going to come, even though they hate FEMA. FEMA is going to come, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they're waiting, and they all panic at exactly the same time. And that's what they do. They panic. And that's the end. There's a line out of Dune, the novel by Frank Herbert, having to do with that whole religious experience, which is what it is. Dune is sort of a parody of the Mormon faith, I guess. But the line is, fear is the mind killer. Fear is the mind killer. And I've always remembered that. I read Dune when I was 17 years old. And 50 years later, I still remember that. Fear is the mind killer. In fact, it's easy. It's kind of a meme. People talk about it. They reference that line a lot. Fear is the mind killer. And what it means is, and the reason why it's so apropos, is because you can think clearly until you're afraid. And then you can't think at all. And it's a sudden transition. You were doing pretty good, and then you couldn't do it. And what you can't do is think. And that's what is the human world. It needs a little bit of help from things like the end of fossil fuels. But as far as I'm concerned, the end of fossil fuels and these related things is simply how we panic. A small decrease in the availability of fossil fuels so that people have to line up to get gas. A small change in the price from, say, $2.50 a gallon to $5.50 a gallon, which is small, really. $2 more a gallon, $3 more a gallon, it should be nothing, right? You spend $3 for a loaf of bread, so $3 more a gallon should be nothing. And yet it will cause panic. It doesn't take much to set people off. And that's what's going to end modernity. The modern world will collapse. This picture, this is Pripyat. This picture right here, this is Pripyat. A real ghost city taken over by nature. And I think, and in the story, is this spoilers? I don't know. You'll probably never read the story, right? I can do this. And in the story, this is the scenario where humans abandon the built human world, and it goes back to nature. It goes back to nature. And is that a bad thing? I don't know. I guess it would be, right? Because we enjoy modernity. We enjoy our modern homes and our water and our electricity and all the other things, right? We like these things. And, to my point, we require these things to survive. We can't live without modernity. We are a domesticated species. We're like the tigers living in the zoo. And the tiger living in the zoo is completely dependent, 100%, on the modern world. The modern world brings the tiger. his water and his food and his veterinary checkups, just like modernity brings us medicine. And if tigers are abandoned in the zoo such that no one is bringing them their food and water, and they can't get out, then that tiger is doomed. That tiger is going to die. It's going to die of dehydration and starvation. And it can rage and it can roar and it can do all the things, but that's not going to save it. It's going to die because of the collapse of the modern world in the zoo. And this has actually happened in real life. There have been zoos that have been suddenly abandoned by nations that simply couldn't support them anymore. Either the staff couldn't go there to work with the animals, or the staff was missing. I think this happened a lot during COVID. There were lots of zoos during lockdown where people just didn't go to the zoo. The people who were supposed to be at the zoo taking care of the animals didn't go to the zoo because they were under lockdown. And what happened to the zoos? What happened to the animals? I don't know, but they were trapped. That's the key. They were trapped. So we are kind of in that position. We are kind of like tigers in the zoo. We are sort of trapped. And when people realize that, that's when they panic. And I think that's how it all comes down. So I'm writing the book. It's kind of a user's manual on how to collapse early and avoid the rush, as people are saying these days. Collapse early and avoid the rush. Yeah, and the whole world becomes a liminal space. Something's wrong. Something's missing. Something looks weird. Even this picture right here. Street lights on, and there's obviously no need for street lights. What's going on here? What has happened to this city? This looks about normal, doesn't it? Until you notice that the plants are growing out the windows of the buildings. Because people panicked. And we couldn't keep it going. We couldn't keep it together. So that's how I think the world ends. I think we're seeing some of that happening in Southern California right now. The way people panicked. Now, it works for them because they're surrounded by a much larger and uninterrupted modernity. But if we have any kind of a global panic, probably over fuel availability or cost, probably interrupted by wars and maybe even artificial shortages, then we will panic too. It'll happen to us. We will all panic. Everybody will panic at the same time for exactly the same reason. And once that happens, then you get a scenario like in my book. Everyone panicking at the same time. And that's it. It's over. And can it ever come back? No, it can't. Because there's not enough people organizing themselves around cooperation to pull it off. 300 years in the making and 3 weeks in the collapse. And that's exactly how it's going to be. I mean, you think the governments will come in and you think that the UN will do something and you think all these things will happen, and it can't. Because there's nobody left behind to make sure it does. There's nobody who's going to pull all the loose ends together. Nobody will do that. And it's possible that the Pacific Palisades will not be rebuilt. And it's possible that Altadena will not be rebuilt. Because people just don't see the point. Even though they are surrounded by the modern world, it's just too difficult. So they don't. And what happened in Pacific Palisades, happened to be a fire, can happen to the entirety of Southern California. And in one of my earlier videos, I just told people living in Southern California, get out. You need to get out. Because this is coming for you. When enough people give up on modernity in Southern California, and there's multiple reasons they might, including fire, but also drought, lack of water, they're all going to panic at the same time. Collapse early and avoid the rush. Collapse early and avoid the rush. That's kind of what you have going on right now. So we'll see. Am I right? I don't know. I've given a lot of thought to it. I've been looking at the recent examples, like in Pacific Palisades and Altadena, using those as examples of how people do behave and how governments do behave. And using that as data, I have come to the conclusion that we are all going to panic. I'm not exactly sure what sets it off. In the book, I have a scenario, but the book is not about that. It's not about the scenario. It's about the trajectory after the event and how people can't pull it together anymore. And when they can't pull it together, modernity collapses. Simple as that. We've been pulling it together for 300 years. We've been cooperating. We had capitalism. We had finances. We had insurance. We had long supply chains. We had manufacturers and consumers. And we pulled it together. We built this thing out of a shared incentive to cooperate on pricing and availability and supply chains and deliveries. It was all this huge agreement. And we agreed to cooperate until we don't. And what happens when we don't? You get the collapse of the human world. And people don't cooperate anymore. Panic. And why do they panic? Because they don't believe it anymore. They don't think they have a place. And they're worried. And they run away. And they take their cooperation with them. So how does this group of people in my fictional book pull it together? Well, that's the interesting part, isn't it? What challenges do they face? How do they cope? How do they pull themselves together? How do they keep it together? How do they keep marching forward? What are the obstacles? How do they overcome the obstacles? What are the agreements a group of people come up with? Not the entirety of the human species, not all of modernity, not capitalism and consumerism and communism and socialism and all the isms, not Catholicism, not any of it. A group of people who find themselves in a position to say, to ask, can we do this? And to answer in the affirmative, yeah, we can try. And that's what the book is about. What does it look like to try? Not to panic, not to shoot your guns into the air and break into the stores and loot them, although all that's going to happen, has nothing to do with you, has everything to do with your neighbors who are going to panic. What does it look like when you don't? What does it look like when your neighbors don't? And what does it look like as you collect people into your group who did not panic? Who are willing to try? What does it look like when you're willing to try? Well, the title of the book is It Was 100 Days. Spoiler alert, it takes 100 days. Modernity collapses in the first 3 weeks, and then it takes 100 days after that to pull it together, to try, to figure it out, to work out the kinks, lower your expectations, set up something that can work, and make it work. 100 days. Beyond that, if you haven't figured all that out, if you haven't answered all those questions and tied up all those loose ends, then after 100 days, you're not there. But if you can get the right group of people and they had the head screwed on straight and they don't panic and they don't fight each other and they don't give up and they try and they overcome, then in 100 days, maybe you're still there. It's been fun to write. And like I said, while I'm writing this, I'm watching how the world is actually unraveling. And what I'm noticing everywhere, every single time, is people giving up, panicking, and running away. Just running away. And failing to do that successfully in many cases. Having nowhere to go, no way to get there. And basically, if it's a big enough problem, if you're heading east and more refugees are heading west, and then you just sit down in the middle of the road, you're done. They're fleeing what you're headed for. And if that's the big enough of a scenario that it's a widespread enough problem, then you just don't have a narrative. You don't have a story. I'm writing a different story where people don't give up. So we'll see what happens with that. That's enough for me. I have other things to do. We will stop streaming. Like and subscribe. And come back to this channel. I might read my book as an audiobook. I might do that here. It's a lot of pages. I don't know. It sounds like a lot of work. But whatever. When it's done, I'll post some information about it and talk about it more here. And you can read my book and you can tell me if I'm full of shit or not. Everybody has a different idea about this. And some people are just not going to like my take on this at all. They're not going to like this take where you have to cooperate. Oh, no, not that. I'd rather have my AR-15 and my dog in my pickup truck, then I'm fine. Yay, me. Yeah, sorry, Buckwheat. I don't think that's going to work. Anyway, enough about me. You have a great